So I'm here today with my colleague Adam Lock, and we're going to do a little bit of a post-game breakdown on the Dairy Nutrition Roundtables that we hosted in the first couple of weeks of December. Unfortunately, I've been massively outdressed by Adam today, so we're here in a festive Christmas spirit just before the holidays, and looking forward to sharing what we learned from this 3-day session that we had. And definitely want to give a shout out to two of our friends from around the country who joined in, Dr. Bill Weiss from Ohio State and Dr. Normand St. Pierre from Purdue Agribusiness, who were generous with their time and shared some thoughts in a couple of the sessions that we had. So Adam, do you want to dive into kind of one of the first big topics that we tackled?
Yeah, thank you, Barry. First of all, I want to also thank everyone that joined us for the meetings. It was good to see some people and hear from other people as well. And hopefully next year we can get back to doing them in person again. Yeah, so as Barry said, you know, we kind of, the beauty of having this as a online session, we were able to do different topics. So, you know, that first day we talked about milk protein. Mostly the second day was a lot on milk pricing and milk components. And the last session was in transition cows. So Barry and I hopefully today can touch on some of those. I think an overarching feature of all of our discussions, especially for here in Michigan, around how we get paid for our milk and, you know, providing what the consumer is wanting and what the consumer is paying for, right? So, you know, some of this is sort of maybe a mindset change on how we talk about this. We've for a long time always talked about, oh, I have 90-pound herd or 100-pound herd. And, you know, I think where we're going and where a lot of people already are now is let's start thinking about the pounds of fat and the pounds of protein that we're producing on the farm, or individual groups or individual cows are producing. You know, we're in Michigan here in that Mideast federal order, same as many milk marketing orders in the country now. Really, as Dr. St. Pierre discussed with us, only really paid for the yields of milk fat and milk protein. You know, other solids are a break even or even a loss, and you know, some with the PPDs and things like that right now, you know, it can cost you more for shipping more of the fluid or the water around. So it really sort of focuses our mind on yield of fat, yield of protein. You know, a lot of people now talk about how do we reach 7 pounds a day? You know, are we at 6 pounds a day, 6.5 pounds a day? And how do we, you know, improve feeding efficiency and nutrient use to increase milk fat, milk protein? And then, you know, when we're within that, you know, today versus 12 months ago is a good example of, you know, which of those components should we be focusing on? Is it milk fat or milk protein? We're kind of coming out of a number of years now where milk fat was worth more than protein. Right now, proteins is very high, maybe somewhat artificially high right now, and you know, be interesting to see where hopefully as the food service sector comes back in next year, hopefully more in school, you know, school usage ramps up again, hopefully next year. Just kind of see where fat and protein sort of come out there, and you know, some of these predictions are maybe fat and protein are going to be fairly even price going forward. So, you know, I think we had some fascinating discussions around that, and we can talk more here now about how we drive milk fat and we drive milk protein to help improve nutrient use, but you know, on-farm profitability.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One study that we shared from my group is one that we published in 2020, where we had some comparisons across 4 diets that were equal in crude protein content, but two of the diets were specifically formulated for more rumen bypass protein to meet predicted MP needs. But we also had a treatment there where we used just soybean meal as kind of the sole concentrate source and simply added lysine and methionine to meet the predicted supply requirements for those amino acids. And we very clearly showed an increase in productivity for the RUP supply diets compared to those that were balanced just for lysine and methionine. So I think probably a lot of nutritionists inherently know this, but it's actually a kind of a rare comparison where we can ask, well, if we think we're meeting lysine methionine needs, do we really need to worry about the overall RUP? And I think the answer was very clearly yes. And so why would that be? We think there's probably other amino acids besides lysine and methionine that can pretty quickly become a constraint on milk protein synthesis and just general milk synthesis if we're focused too much just on those two amino acids. Adam, what's your latest? You've done so much work, made so much progress on feeding fats to efficiently deliver milk fat for value, right? So what's the latest that you shared on that space?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. I think that's a nice sort of segue with how you're talking about some of your work there around looking at maybe, lowering crude protein and thinking beyond crude protein to thinking about amino acids. And I think that's where the last 5 to 10 years we really made a lot of headway on the fat component of the diet, and just getting away from thinking of fat as simply as an energy source and all fat being the same, to trying to better understand individual amino acids and blends of amino acids, of fatty acids, sorry. So all fatty acids that we talk about really have the same energy content, but it's now understanding what effects they have in the rumen, the small intestine, and the mammary gland. And whether they're specific physiological effects, metabolic effects, or are they having impacts on digestibility. So, milk fat has been a big component of that, feeding certain fatty acids to help improve milk fat, but we're kind of moving beyond that now as well. I think one of the big things that we continue to learn more about is dietary supply specific fatty acids and how that impacts milk fat production. I think the key fatty acid there in terms of supplemental fatty acids is palmitic acid. And I think that's why we've seen such a rise in the use of palmitic enriched fat supplements. We've seen that in early lactation and throughout lactation. I think we probably think from a biological point of view, a key component of that is if you think about milk fat is basically triglycerides, so you've got 3 fatty acids on a glycerol backbone. The mammary gland utilizes palmitic acid to initiate triglyceride synthesis. So the more palmitic acid we can supply to the mammary gland, the more triglycerides she can make. And then because she has to make a fluid milk fat, some of these short and longer chain fatty acids get packaged with that to maintain that fluid milk fat. So we increase yield rather than substituting some fatty acids out for others, which we see in many other situations. I think another key part we've seen the last few years is sort of breaking some of the old dogma, that was formed in the 80s, early 90s. And one of the big ones was, feeding fat lowers fiber digestibility. And we don't see that with some of this modern type of, fat feeding practices, specific fatty acids. And the real game changer there is we consistently see that when we feed additional palmitic acid, we improve fiber digestibility, on average 3 to 4 percentage points total tract. And I think that helps drive more milk fat. We get more acetate production. There's acetate's a key component of de novo fatty acids. And that helps us get more energy from the diet overall as well. Challenge is we can't capture that in nutrition models per se, right? So, but I think it's something to be cognizant of there. Then the other area we've really been playing around with is oleic acid as well. We're very interested in oleic acid across lactation and different uses at different times. Oleic acid clearly helps improve fatty acid digestibility. And that's a big challenge with higher and higher producing cows eating more fat flowing out the rumen, predominantly stearic acid. And so we need to do, I think, what we can to improve digestibility. And then oleic acid, we think, also has some specific effects on adipose tissue and insulin sensitivity. And we actually just got a recent USDA grant recently, Dr. Contreras in our vet school and I, to look at that further. So we're very excited about that. And the same as you're talking around on the amino acid side, and I think we'll talk more in a while about different diets of different cows. I don't think there's a simple bag of fat that you feed all cows on the farm. We need to start tailoring that more, and I think that comes into a bigger on some of that as well.
Yep. One of the things we spend a fair bit of time on is this. Well, just recently, I'd say it's probably related to international trade and China increasing buying, but we are seeing corn prices rise. We're especially seeing protein sources rise in price, and so kind of coming back to the age-old question of how do you sharpen your pencil and reevaluate the input costs in your diets and really consider what's providing return on investment. in our discussion with Normand, I think we came to a really clear point that I think is worth considering, is that if we're looking at feed ingredients that are more than just supplying a nutrient, that we're saying it's having a physiological effect, and that's why we're feeding it, that may prove worthwhile, for any cow on the farm, but it's most likely to have a good bang for the buck in the transition period, because you've shown in your work, others, our work has also shown this, that cows that start their lactation right, you tend to see carryover effects for weeks or months even. And so it's a lot easier to sort of justify how you could recoup an investment in an expensive rumen bypass amino acid in a specialty fat source that's going to have programming effects on the cow than if you start feeding it sort of mid-lactation or later. So I think that's an important point that, like you said, we'll come back to this idea of how do you precision feed cows and not feed everybody the same. We also talked a little bit, somebody brought up the point of it's always important, but especially important as feed prices rise, to capture every ounce of value you can out of your own crop ground on a farm. So limiting shrink, just making sure we're doing an excellent job with feed storage, with harvest, and thinking really critically about how do we get the most bang for our buck out of the acres that we have. So in picking corn silage genetics and choosing whether to replant alfalfa, all those things, we have to look at the scenario on a given farm. What's our cost to bring in protein? What's our cost to bring in calories in the form of starch? And how do we work around those unique situations on a farm?
Related to that as well, Barry, and last year was a good example of this. If there isn't such a good growing year for your homegrown forages, and you may be short of forage because of poor growing conditions, or you may be limited in forage inventory because you're growing in farm size, is what can we do to maybe make up that forage shortfall, or what opportunities do we have for feeding lower forage diets? And I think we both presented some of our own work in those fields as well. And we specifically did a MAAA, Michigan Alliance for Animal Agriculture study last year, focused on that, where we dropped forage NDF from a typical Michigan mid-lactation diet, 19-20% forage NDF. We dropped it down to about 12% forage NDF, which raised a few eyebrows here in Michigan, but of course, maybe that's not so atypical if you go out west or somewhere like that. But through the use of a high amount of byproducts, cottonseed, soy hulls, sugar beet, and then coming in with some supplemental amino acids like you were talking about earlier to help with amino acid quality at MP supply, and some palmitic acid to help improve milk fat there. With that low forage diet, very much a demonstration study, we actually were able to increase pounds of fat, pounds of protein per cow compared to the conventional diet. And the additional cost of that diet was more than recouped by that. So, there's different ways you can look at that. It's possible to formulate these low forage diets to maintain or increase milk components if you're short of forage, or you can maybe use this as a strategy to overall maybe improve and drive yields of fat, yields of protein. And I know you've done some similar work with byproducts as well.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I think, the way I think about our role is to try to help provide people with tools in their toolkit, so that that's the difficult thing on a ruminant operation, where you're relying on year-to-year variation in forages and crop conditions and such, that you have to be nimble and flexible. And I think this study you did, I was pretty excited about the results. It shows that we can maintain productivity, with very different types of strategies to get there.
Yeah, I think while we're talking about some of the information from our guest speakers, I think and nutrients in the diet, I think Dr. Weiss made some interesting comments in this and in some other talks I've seen. We talk about different feeds, but feeds is just a way to supply nutrients to the cow. And, and then how do we price out different feeds? And so I'd give a shout out to he just did earlier this week a webinar for hordes, specifically focused on that. So there's more information there. But, the big take home from what I get from some of talking with Dr. Weiss there was, just because it might be cheap to buy nutrients from a specific feed that's only the input side. We also have to think about the output side. So there's a, we have to weigh up the inputs versus the output. So just because something's cheap to buy, to put in the diet, if that's lowering or hurting yield of fat, yield of protein coming out, it might not look like such a good buy then. So again, he has more information in that recent Hordes webinar that came out earlier this week that I enjoyed, and we had a good discussion about that in our session as well.
And certainly both his comments in that space and Normand's, I guess, played to our biases, where they made the point that, if the nutrition model could predict all these things perfectly, as a nutrition consultant, you wouldn't have a job. We wouldn't need you. And we're nowhere near there, right? So we do have to employ logic and maybe a little bit of art sometimes. But the interaction of the animal with the diet is so complicated and so nuanced that's really where the good nutritionists, earn their pay, I guess, is my way to think about it. Another thing that I've seen over the last 6 months is Bill's work on transition cow protein, and he shared some data from a study that they should have out soon. It's not quite published yet, but pretty impressive responses to feeding additional metabolizable protein to transition cows. And all they did was say, well, given normal intakes, how much protein, how much MP do we actually need to supply to try to make these cows balance for protein? So they're not losing protein mass, they're not losing muscle tissue, for example, during the first 2 or 3 weeks postpartum, and how will cows respond if we supply that? There had been some previous work decades ago on that, but much smaller studies. And so they did a really fairly powerful study and showed that feeding about 20% crude protein to get the MP needed for these cows resulted in some pretty nice responses. Cows ate better, they made more milk, and there's some other treatments in there that I don't really want to dig into right now, but I'm excited about that. And I think that's a very simple point that really more nutritionists should think about. How do we get enough metabolizable protein into fresh cows? I
think that tied in nicely with a talk that Jackie Borman at Purdue University did last year at Tri-State, where she'd done some estimations and measurements of how much protein, muscle protein, cows are losing in that fresh period. So to me, that really hit home when Dr. Weiss showed us some of that data. So I'm fairly new to the transition cow world. The last 3 or 4 years, we've been more work in there, but clearly that transition cow is where we have a lot more opportunity to impact, not just that fresh period, but throughout the whole of her lactation by setting her up right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about. I've been really excited by the work you've put out in the last couple of years in transition cows. Talk us through what you're finding now with oleic acid and palmitic combinations.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Yeah, so we took a lot of our work in post-peak cows where we'd really focused on palmitic and oleic acid and their blends, and showing differences, partitioning between milk, energy to milk versus energy into body weight, and we took that into the fresh cow. Our first study, we really focused on palmitic acid enriched supplementation in the fresh and the peak period. And we got some fantastic production responses, about 4.5 kilos over the first 10 weeks of lactation. And then improvements in both that fresh and the peak period. Now, in the fresh period, while we got those nice improvements, those cows did lose about 25 kilos more body weight to palmitic acid, which, is a possible concern. Our study wasn't designed there to look at health disorders or anything, but there was no overt obvious signs of any different challenges. But our work with oleic acid got us really interested. If oleic acid improves digestibility, maybe improves insulin release or insulin sensitivity, there was some evidence there. Maybe we could get the production increases without losing additional body weight. So we did a study. It's going to be out early next year in JDS. Just got the page proofs back a couple of days ago, actually, where we looked at altering the ratio of palmitic and oleic acid in 1.5% dry matter supplemental fat blends, and that's basically just made them with a traditional calcium salt versus a traditional palmitic enriched prill, and just blending them together. Again, what we saw is when we fed their palmitic enriched, we got more milk, but they lost a bit more body weight. But when we came in with the higher oleic levels going up from 10 up to 30% oleic acid, so our highest blend there had 60% palmitic, 30% oleic. We got more milk in the fresh period, more yield of fat, yield of protein. It's about 4.5 kilos more energy corrected milk. But they did not lose any more body weight than the control cows that weren't supplemented. So we kind of got the best of both worlds there. So that was pretty exciting. What we then got even more excited about, that was just a 3-week feeding period from calving for the first 21 days, 24 days. We then followed all those cows out for the next 7 weeks, just on the same common diet. And those cows that were fed those fat blends, all of our fatty acid blends in the first 3 weeks, they maintained over a 4 kilo more energy corrected milk throughout the next 7 weeks. So this idea of programming or setting up the cow in that fresh period to then carry on producing more milk, even though they were on the same diet later on, was really fascinating to us, and then led us to say, well, if we'd carried on with maybe that blend of fatty acids in that peak period, could we got another bump up again? Because if not, maybe you do just focus your fatty acids in that first 3 weeks. So we recently just presented a study at ADSA this summer where we then took that 60-30 blend, this time as a calcium salt that had been pre-made for us. And we fed it in the fresh and the peak period. And actually, when we fed it in the peak, we got another milk bump up again, milk energy corrected milk. So that's really interesting. And like I said, we just got a USDA grant now focused on oleic acid. Andreas Contreras in our vet school has some really fascinating more metabolic mechanism data in adipose tissue. We think oleic acid has some effects in adipose tissue. So now we're going to go back hopefully in the future and look at oleic acid in the pre-fresh as well as the fresh period. But the big thing for me there is that programming in that first 3 weeks, and we talked about some of the work Dr. Weiss had there. What opportunities do we have in the future setting that cow up right straight from calving, and what long-term impacts that has? And I think you should mention you have some data on that. There's even more acute changes that probably focuses the mind on that fresh period.
You bet. Yeah, we've done studies 5-6 years ago now where giving anti-inflammatory drugs, even as little as one time about 24 hours post-calving, has had significant effects, increasing milk yield for up to 10 months. And so, across these different interventions that have carryover effects, it's really an interesting broad question to me is, biologically, how does that work? Particularly with a drug that's going to be in the system for maybe 10 to 14 days at most. How can it possibly affect the cow 300 days later? And, we're really interested in trying to understand that, which may then lead to more applied interventions that can at least help us to fine tune maybe fatty acid, amino acid, B vitamin, whatever, different kinds of strategies that really might help that cow get off on the right foot. And hopefully, if we understand it mechanistically, we can do that in a way that it's not robbing from health or reproduction or what have you. Okay, so yeah, I think that's an exciting area that we have a really nice team at Michigan State. I think hopefully we can collaborate on in the future. One of the things that people bring up, maybe you can talk about, Adam, is, and it's a fair point, right? So it's fine to have this fancy science and you can show that cows respond amazingly to these targeted nutrition interventions. But if it's not economically practical to feed that to your whole herd, you have to figure out how to have a separate group of cows that you can feed in that beginning window of time, right? Assuming it's a feed additive. So we talked a little bit about the challenges of that, particularly with smaller farms and ways around that.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the sort of, maybe the pushback on some of this is I can only have one diet on my farm, or, and I think that's a farm by farm basis. And I think that's where the nutritionists can really help the producers, and a lot of my thinking on this has been driven by spending the last 10 years or so with Dr. Allen as well, talking about grouping strategies as well. But, I think the bottom line for it is that a cow at 10 days in lactation is a very different cow than the one at 300 days in lactation. And everyone in between is different as well. So if you have one diet, which cow are you feeding? You're probably formulating a diet for a cow at 150 days in milk, but that means you're probably overfeeding the late lactation cow and underfeeding the early lactation cow. And Dr. Weiss's work with those higher levels of crude protein in the fresh cow really hits home on that one, I think. And so
Yeah.
you may be clipping the peak off early lactation cows, you're probably putting on too much body weight in late lactation cows. And, you know, with BST going away, that's probably really exacerbated this, because you could get away with that probably more back when there was more BST being used. But, you know, if there's more than one pen on the farm and there's more than one TMR wagon load being fed every day, I think there are opportunities. And for me, it'd be looking at what's the marginal benefits. It's the same as if we're talking about getting that extra third of a pound, half a pound of milk components. What's the marginal benefit of getting there? So it may cost a bit more to do some of this, but what's the benefit? And the management has to be right as well. You know, one of the comments or feedback often is, well, this cow that's meant to be in this pen, after the last 5 milking, she's moved 4 different pens now.
Yep.
And then that comes down to management, I think. And,
yep.
But, you know, the work that we've talked about from our own labs and from other people's labs, you know, clearly shows that there is benefits on production efficiency and milk component production, which means better milk check, to getting the right different, you know, targeted nutrition of cows with different groups. So, you know, I think the data is there to support that, and now it comes down to a lot of the practical application of some of that.
Sorry. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the farm to farm specifics are really key there. So I wanted to throw out that, you know, the MSU Dairy Extension team as a whole, between us and between the educators in the field, I think this is a great way that we can help management teams, nutrition consultants with farm managers, come in, kind of evaluate and maybe provide some suggestions about, on this particular farm at this scale and this type of pen arrangement, here's a way we would suggest approaching this. And we can even help with doing some of the return on investment math. There's some nice tools out there that we can help sort of project what is this going to do in terms of revenue and costs. And that can help motivate decisions, I guess, on whether it's worth some additional management intensity if you get this kind of return on that time input. So I think that's a place that we can be of assistance. Another thing we talked about, I'll bring up quickly, is a lot of discussion about, well, what keeps fresh cows from eating well? And that's a perennial problem. And we have a study that's just actually in final print in the January 2021 issue of Journal Dairy Science, where we collaborated with colleagues at the University of Florida and Cornell University to put together a data set of almost 500 transition cows, where we had daily feed intake data, which is pretty hard to get your hands on. And we were really focused on an inflammatory marker, trying to ask the question, does this marker provide a really good insight into those cows that are not eating well because they have sort of illness behavior expressing? We were somewhat disappointed in the results, to be frank. This marker AGP was predictive of poor intake, but it wasn't very precise in its prediction. In fact, as a sort of a clinical biomarker, it performed quite poorly. But considering that and other inflammatory markers that can be used, it is pretty clear that there's a relationship there, and at least a subset of our cows are probably not eating as well as they could because of inflammatory conditions. Now, there are other things that matter. Hepatic oxidation, Mike Allen has talked about for many years. That's a key thing. If you're feeding a real conservative diet, we know from other studies that forage fiber, just bulk in the rumen, can constrain intake in fresh cows and actually lead to more ketosis. But this inflammatory thing is a little harder to get our arms around because you can't look at a diet and predict it. And, you know, we're really, in my opinion, at the very front end of understanding that. So I'm interested in collaborating with herds and ask people to reach out to me if they'd like to work together on trying to get maybe a 20 to 50 herd sort of overview study to see if we can look at markers of transition cow success and see to what extent these inflammatory blood markers can predict those kind of outcomes. Because there are some nice studies with hundreds of animals involved where we have some relationships like that, but there's been very little work looking at a large number of farms and farm to farm, cohort to cohort. Does that tell us more than animal to animal, which we basically don't get data back quick enough on individual animals to really be all that useful yet. So it's something I'm hoping to work on moving forward here in Michigan.
Yeah, that sounds exciting. I think you mentioned about immune function, and I was fortunate enough to participate in the ADSA Discover conference a couple of months ago on transition cows. And nearly every discussion topic around the transition cow ended up coming back to immune function and inflammation. And it was fascinating that where a lot of this is converging. So I think that's a really exciting area to be working on in the future. And I think what excites me with yourself joining here and many other people we have in that interest in that transition dairy cow is I think MSU, hopefully we can make some real inroads around that transition cow, immunity, immune function, and where that fits into all these practical applications on farm in the future. So it's exciting right now.
I agree. Well, Adam, that's about all that was in my head from the meeting. I enjoyed it. I know when I interviewed to potentially come here, this is the roundtable is one of those things that people pointed to as a really successful, important part of our overall extension efforts in dairy here. And I hope people will keep engaging in this and we can get more discussion going in future meetings, which hopefully can be at least in part in person. Any other take homes from you?
No, I think that's it. I think excited to be able to do these again. And this has been a good discussion as well, recapping this. So, I hope everyone that participated in the meetings were able to take home a few take-home messages to help to maybe try and implement in their own feeding strategies. And feel free to continue to reach out. I've had a few phone calls since the meetings. I'm sure you have as well. Feel free to reach out to us or the educators in your areas as well. And always happy to get feedback, questions, comments. So that helps drive our research programs as well. So thank you. Thanks for putting this together, Barry.
Yep, good discussion, Adam. Thank you. Take care, everybody.